All right, we're right at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining in on this important conversation today. My name is Stephanie Bradley. I am a senior manager with the Workforce and Education team at TPMA. And our topic of the hour is WIOA, reauthorization, preparing for what's next. With that being said, I want to kind of set the stage before we get started and kind of address the elephant in the room. We do not know the specifics of what is going to happen with this reauthorization. While the specifics of how things will unfold are kind of still remain uncertain, the specifics of the goal for today is to provide you all with some strategies and insights to really help navigate potential changes. We're looking forward to sharing some guidance and words of wisdom to support your preparation efforts that are underway, and then encourage you to drop your questions in the chat as we move throughout. And now that we're all kind of on the same page and we know what we're here to kind of go through and discuss today, I'm really excited to announce our panel, who many of us know and love. And we're going to start with Carol. Carol, can you briefly tell us who you are and a little bit about your professional background as it relates to the public workforce system?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carol D'Amico, and I'm an advisor to TPMA. And I've been in workforce development for a very long time. In fact, I was counting up. I think this is either my 8th or 9th transition that I have lived through. So I can relate to probably some of the anxiety and unsettledness that some of you all are feeling. I've been in many roles in workforce development at the state, federal, and local level. I served as Assistant Secretary to the U.S. Department of Education under George W. Bush. And so I've held many roles in the policy and in the practice of workforce development.
Thank you so much, Carol. Ron, how about yourself?
Thanks, Stephanie, and Thomas and Carol. Good to be with you and with all of you. I see a lot of familiar names. I've been in workforce development as Carol has for quite some while. I started my career in all of this in a rural 3-county consortium in Western Pennsylvania. Spent time there. On loan to the Department of Labor, back to Pennsylvania as the founding director of the Three Rivers Workforce Investment Board in Pittsburgh, PA, now called Partner for Work. And then spent 14 years at the National Association of Workforce Boards, now in private practice, working with some local workforce boards, private companies, and doing some work for ETA on technical assistance with some of their grantees, and doing a fair amount of work in North Carolina.
Thank you so much, Ron. And last but certainly not least, the TPM and TPMA, Mr. Tom.
Well, thanks, Stephanie. I can put another notch in my belt or resume or something, because I'm now on a panel with Ron Painter and Carol D'Amico. So I feel like I've accomplished something. In all seriousness, I first met Carol when I was a placement interviewer in a Work One back in the 1970s. We won't say which year in the 70s, but anyway, I've been in workforce for a long time, obviously, and have worked as a placement interviewer. I eventually was very fortunate to be appointed director of what's called Department of Workforce Development in Indiana. I've had a consulting firm for 35 years or so, and work closely with Ron, who I respect greatly, as do Carol. So good to be here, and I also see a lot of familiar names.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. So we're going to dive right in and start asking some questions, and I'm going to shoot it off to a couple of people first. And so, Ron, I want to start with you.
Uh-oh.
From your perspective, what are the most significant challenges and opportunities presented by the current proposed provisions in the A Stronger Workforce for America Act? And how might these impact the overall workforce system?
Well, I think you started off the conversation by saying, talking about the environment we're in. I see OMB has rescinded their notice. I certainly don't think it's the last time we're going to hear about the appropriations discussions around workforce development and education. I mean, clearly, I think as the administration settles in, we're going to see more conversation. I think that said, the environment that the legislation comes into with the 119th is, I think, significantly different than the 118th. First of all, Republicans continue to control the House, and that's really, to me, going to be the driver of whatever happens for reauthorization. And then, frankly, does the Senate even have any appetite for workforce development and for WIOA reauthorization? I think that's one of the questions. I think what we saw in ASWA, I guess I would focus more on the upside, and that is that we continue to see the emergence of a focus on business and business engagement in federal investments in workforce development. I think, if you look back at the history of federal involvement in workforce development, it's been this iteration of employer connection and then kind of partnership. And now I think in ASWA, very deep involvement, both from the standpoint of the employer-directed skill development, but also from the Critical Skills Fund. And I also think, deservedly, the bill really calls out business services. I think if there's one thing that, or among some, but I think if there's one thing that we've not paid enough attention to in WIOA, that is business services. And in this case, business services, which I'm really happy to see, part of what they're now allowed to do is to provide technical assistance to employers. Everybody in the system knows when you go into a small business in particular, there's no HR department. There's no director of skill development, So being able to provide them with really good advice and really good support around skill development, I think is really important. Clearly, the areas of the percentage of training, which, Carol and I, as you will find out, both have opinions on things. I certainly have an opinion on percentage of funding. I think that's an area of concern. I don't know how much we've actually cleaned up the funding for the one-stop system. And I think that's still a little dicey. I don't know that we've gone far enough with the ETPL, changing the ETPL. So I think those are areas that I think we should continue to focus on in the 119th, along with funding.
Carol or Tom, do you all have anything to add?
No, I don't. I guess one thing I would add is that for the first time in any workforce program, the United States is going to have to deal with a talent shortage. And that's kind of a new topic. There's not any instant answers, but it's certainly something to begin thinking about as everyone follows the activities in the reauthorization. And so there are a number of topics like that are going to be, I think, important to consider in light of whatever the eventual bill looks like.
All right, thank you.
I guess I would just say a couple of things from more of a policy perspective, which is where I come from. And I think most people on the call are familiar with the term reading the room. So as I'm reading the room, which means sort of the atmosphere in Washington and how it might affect us at the state and local levels, what I see are really three compelling themes. One of certainly disruption. I mean, this administration is not about tinkering around the edges. It's talking about whether whole agencies ought to exist, like FEMA and Department of Education. So certainly business as usual is probably not going to be the mode of operation in this administration, at the administration level or in Congress. And along with that, I think comes innovation and the role of the private sector and questioning whether the federal government should even be involved in certain things. I mean, does anybody really on the call think that it should still be involved in things like the occupational handbook and ONET to talk about jobs in demand or skills in demand? I mean, those are sort of anachronisms. What can the private sector do cheaper, faster, and better? And I think that's going to be an ongoing theme. And then finally, I think we have to acknowledge that this administration is going to be about the worker. This is the era of the worker. That was the campaign from the administration. The incoming Secretary of Labor, when confirmed, is very pro-union. Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters Union is going to be very heavily influential in the administration. And it's going to be, how do we lift up incumbent workers? How do we get people up the ladder? And so I think it has a lot of implications for workforce development. The incumbent worker, on-the-job training, more resources for training, identification of skills, more alignment with employers, more alignment with an economic development. In Indiana, where we are, where TPMA is housed, the Department of Workforce Development that houses the WIOA program has been merged with or underneath the Economic Development Office. Huge signal there. So I think these are three sort of influential factors that we ought to consider as we go about thinking about the future of workforce development.
Yeah, Stephanie,
Okay.
I think Carol and Tom both raise a really good point, and that is that I know I sit here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania looking at the demographics, looking at the decline of the number of high school graduates. If you look, I think West Virginia will experience the largest decline of high school graduates in the nation. The Commonwealth will be in double digits. So I do think, while whoever can talk endlessly about lifelong learning, I think the system is front and center, and the states are front and center in how are we going to solve that problem. And I think, again, that's an upside to ASWA, is the increase in the amount of funding that can be dedicated to incumbent workers. And so I think states and locals, there are a number of states that have put general revenue money into workforce development. I think you're gonna see that out of necessity continue, and I think it's going to be aimed at how do we get people skilled quickly.
I think too, Ron, I think that's a good point. I think with 40% of the population has a college degree. That's not going to change. We're not going to see any big increase in that. So we're talking about 60% of the population that is going to need to be upskilled, but not necessarily through a post-secondary, traditional post-secondary experience. And that has a lot to say about the workforce development system. Again, looking at providers that are better, faster, cheaper, and aligned to the skills. And I can't say that a lot of states have gotten it right yet, but they will. And I think it's an opportunity to look at waivers. I think this administration is going to be receptive to innovation and waivers on how do we take care of that 60% of the population.
Thank you. So I want to kind of keep that same momentum. Carol, you started to kind of touch in on that. So I'm going to start with you on this one. So some of those proposed updates in ASWA, it's definitely going to touch multiple stakeholders. Of course, the local workforce boards, colleges and universities, but also economic development organizations. How do you envision the proposed changes really shaping their roles and responsibilities in the years ahead?
Well, I think as it relates to economic development, one thing I think the workforce system is going to be should be able to work much more closely with them as companies either expand or build new facilities in regions or states. I think there's going to be very robust opportunity to provide rich data in terms of skills and competencies and things like that, and literally develop some customized type of services and programs to be able to deliver the workforce to new and expanding businesses.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have any feedback around there?
We've gone 15 minutes and no one has used the AI, so let's not forget about it and the challenges it presents our entire society.
We're getting there, Tom. We're getting there.
I think those 2 points, AI and data, I think are going to be critical as we move forward. We have more data than we could ever process or we know what to do with. The question becomes, how do we do the analytics? And so I think one of the challenges facing local workforce boards, and I think the states as well, is, to your point, local government invests, I don't know, $30+ billion a year in economic development. So how do the states allow local workforce boards that flexibility to work closely with economic development, not only on what is here, but in a sense, what's expected to come? And so I think part of the challenge again for workforce boards is this whole policy, is this whole data analysis, is this notion of where as a region are we going? What businesses are critical to begin with? What businesses are seeing investment growth? What businesses are poised to radically change? So I also think at the same time that boards are looking externally, I think the issue becomes internally, and it's why, again, one of the reasons, again, I so support business-led boards at the state and local level, and that is that I think private sector board members can help local workforce boards look at this idea of internal efficiency, internal effectiveness, and what does this mean for how our organization needs to structurally change to not only meet the kind of outreach efforts that we've got to do to attract the workers that we want to see, but then how do we do this data analysis? How do we do how do we do this policy going forward?
So just so we're kind of stay right there where we're at, how do they kind of use that data to really kind of better measure their outcomes?
Well, I mean, I guess I would ask Tom and Carol if they would agree. I mean, when you talk to business will tell you that not everybody is a customer. So you have to make decisions about who is your customer. And then come the questions of, so what's happening in our customers' world? How, as an organization, if we want them to continue to be a customer, how do we have to adapt? What standards do we have to hit in order to continue to be a source of supply for that business? So I think those become some of the critical questions for workforce board directors, the director to the board, to think about on a daily basis. Who is our customer? And I think that's where the board has to get engaged. The board has to also think about, what are the collective assets we have in our region? Who are the really good service providers? What's the good, really skill development system we have? What are the employers, the caliber of employers we want to work with? And so I think those are really critical questions that the local boards have to ask. And then I think they've got to negotiate that with the state.
I agree with you, Ron, and I think they have to negotiate that with the feds. I think that more flexibility is needed and probably will be given to the states to define customers. And if a local board or a state wants to put 90% of its resources into a certain population, say incumbent workers, to prepare them for the future, then I think if a governor made that case, and I just said 90, but if a governor made the case, I mean, I see again under this innovation platform of the administration, cases could be made for much more flexibility for locals and states to define their own customers and not be beholden to the feds dictating that. And that's maybe not a popular thing to say. I should have said at the outset that all of the opinions I expressed today do not necessarily represent those of Tom Miller or TPMA. So I'll say
I
that.
like that, Carol. I would second that. The opinions expressed today are mine. They are not Thomas Miller. But I think that's a really good point. I think you're also seeing. I was looking the other day. I think it's well over 2,000 pieces of legislation were introduced in state legislatures addressing post-secondary education issues, and quite a bit of that focused on accountability. Here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the legislature has kicked off a task force around what we would have known at the federal level as gainful employment. How many people start a program and complete? Not just how many people got paid by, using their American Express card or their, Visa card. How many started? How many completed? How many entered employment? And what was that cost of getting the skill development? What's that return in terms of the wages of the individuals? I think this is partly to the push in the question around what are we getting for these investments we're making. But the second part of it, I think, is legislators at the federal and state level hear about students overwhelmed by student debt. So I think this is kind of a late, but I think a pretty forceful examination of what are we getting.
Well, there's similar legislation in Indiana right now that will mandate all colleges, including the state's community college, to report that at the baccalaureate, sub-baccalaureate, and certification level. Did people get jobs in the fields for which they were prepared? And what did they make 1 year out, 5 years out, and 10 years out? And is that information available to consumers so they can make informed choices? And there would be no reason why workforce boards shouldn't take on the role of being the arbiter of quality or the arbiter of ROI. And I think that would be a great role for a workforce board.
I would agree, Carol. And as boards are thinking about, our local organizations are thinking about advocacy and what do I say to the state legislature? What do I say to the feds? Workforce boards, since they were created and continue, have to answer that question of how many people completed, who earned a credential, how many went to work, what were their wages, how long they've been in the labor force. So I think part of the upside for workforce boards is being able to go back to legislators and say, hey, while you're worried about what credential matters, let me tell you, we know what matters because we're in touch with business. We know that we're in touch with the job seeker. When we're also in touch with the outcomes. So I think that data, Tom, I think, I looked at the data that the task force in Pennsylvania is asking. I could send them a section of WIOA and say, hey, this is what you're looking for. This is the stuff that you want to ID. So I do think it's a good opportunity to talk about what boards do with regard to performance.
So let's say right here around training. And so, given as was emphasis on training, what strategies should organizations and community leaders adopt to really encourage and implement that skills-based training practices, Ron, that you kind of mentioned earlier? And then what immediate actions can they take now to ensure alignment with this emphasis? And Carol, I want to pitch it over to you first.
Well, as I said, reading the room, this is the year of the incumbent worker. And these are folks that are working and need additional training to move up the skill ladder and up the wage ladder. And the way to do that is through relevant training. And the role of employers in identifying those training opportunities and providing them and designing them, I think it's a great opportunity to put resources along those lines. And not leave it to vendors like community colleges, third parties to determine that, and to hope and pray that they're offering things, that training that is actually needed. I think workforce boards have to make their own determination, and the only way that you can really do that is to get engaged with employers. I've sort of lost track, and maybe Ron, you need to educate me a little bit on where we are with on the job, the OJT sort of components. But I think they were always underutilized, overregulated, and I think it's time maybe to bring those back. But maybe I'm not current on that.
No, I liked your phrase overregulated, because the system is rather risk averse, and it has to do with with the I don't know whether you want to call it the intensity of monitoring or oversight, but this is an industry that is highly regulated, and I think sometimes we react too much to the regulation, and to your point, Carol, not pushing innovation enough, pushing and then pushing the state and pushing the feds. But I think to go back to one of your questions, Stephanie, I think you don't have to go very far to find boards whose budget is less than WIOA is less than 100% of their budget. In some cases, I was talking to a board not too long ago. WIOA is 11% of their budget. So, but the mechanisms that they work with people in terms of career exploration and in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of work experience, is pretty extensive. But one of the issues that I see is, and that I experienced, when I know Brad's on here, when I sat in Brad's seat, was that what Congress sees is a very limited database of WIOA. Most of the time, they don't even see Title II data, because that's not held by the Department of Labor. That's over in the Department of Education. But they also don't see what funding some of the boards get. I know some of the boards get CDBG funding, CSBG funding. They are working with TANF funds. They are working with philanthropic funds. They are working with, if you're talking about San Antonio, they're working with local funds and many state funds. So I think part of the challenge to local boards is when they're talking to state legislators, and God, hopefully they are, is that they are presenting the entire picture of their impact on career choices at that regional level, because I also think that is key to the boards. They're not just managing WIOA; they're managing a pretty big landscape of WIOA funding. And I think one of the boards that I was with not too long ago, 17 funding streams to achieve what they do. So I think that we've really got to explain more about the impact. And I think that's what, as boards are thinking about, well, how do we talk about this to the state legislators, to federal legislators? I think it's that idea of impact and how big that impact is. And I think also the work that they're doing in the community.
All right. Go ahead, Tom. You had something?
I was gonna echo and kind of double down on what Ron was saying, and he used the word impact, which I agree with, and I'd also use the word results. Make sure when you communicate, you're talking not about programs, but about results and outcomes and impact.
All right. So, Tom, this one's for you. As the reauthorization progresses, what proactive steps should organizations take to align themselves with potential funding and programmatic changes? And then how can they strengthen cross-sector partnerships to prepare for these potential changes?
I think it was Ron and Carol have both spoken about innovation, and innovation should not wait until the ink's dry on the document. I mean, start thinking about innovation now in advance of knowing the full written document. The document's going to reflect the input they received, and we all could probably be about 85-90% accurate with what it's going to attempt to achieve. So start now, start engaging with stakeholders now, and be prepared and be ready to go. When you finalized the direction you're headed. Don't bend to the rules and the law. Make them bend to you. A little bit of risk, but hey, makes life fun.
Ryan, you came off mute.
Yeah, I saw a comment. Ben asked a question of, how do you do a better job of getting that message across? And I think this is one of the challenges with technology and with data is that, while there's a reporting system, I think it has to get better at, and maybe it is, get better at getting that data back to where that data originates from. And secondly, Ben, again, both Brad and I, as he sits there and I sat there, Lordy, do we know that data is not always accurate when it gets to the federal level. We looked just before I left at apprenticeship, and we saw an entire state was credited with 210 apprentices. That's impossible. That is absolutely impossible. But that's the data that's at the federal level. So I think boards collectively in a state, and I would really encourage you, I think it happened a while ago, but look, if you've got you have the beginnings of a good IT department, why can't the boards that surround you work with you to support that IT department, expand the capabilities of that IT department so that, 6 boards in a region are using the same technology, they're getting the same tech support, which is probably better than any of them can afford. I think that's part of the innovation that's in there. If you have somebody who sits on your board that's in retail, gosh, if they haven't already, have them walk through your one-stop system and help you think about how do you better serve the customer. Not only the customer that walks through the door, but what's the strategy of getting the kind of skill that you want to walk through the door. I know talking to some of the local boards not long ago about the chip technology plants. Okay, we know that there are probably now I'm going to forget, but let's just say there's 5 core skills to that chip technician. How are you reaching out to people who may have 3 of those skill sets to talk about what's the potential for them, to Carol's point earlier, to find higher wages, better employment? So I think if you've got retail on your workforce board, wow, put them to work. Get them to help you redesign how you're meeting the customer, both internally and externally. Your website, examine your website. Could you even find your way to you on your website?
Absolutely, thank you. So we do have another question out here that's asking about rural local boards and any thought around how they are to meet the 50% mandate, especially with them only having 8% of supported services. So I guess they're looking for some, maybe insight on how to help those smaller boards to have smaller funding. I can see the wheels turning.
Well, I mean, geez, I hate to give up on the issue of the mandate, which I don't see as good public policy. Look, if I have $100 in funding, all I need to do is tell my frontline staff, forget about Pell. Don't ask for any reimbursement from Pell. Don't ask any reimbursement for TANF. Don't engage any of the other funds that we have access to. Just the first $50 that you're going to pay in training, just pay it. What is that what we're trying to achieve? If that was the case, we would have incredible outcomes for Pell. That's not what gets somebody to the completion line. And again, I think we've got to come back and we've got to continue to point out how do people complete? Well, they complete because there's people helping them all along the way. As a coach, as a mentor, as a somebody to turn to when life happens. That's how people complete. So I think we really got to continue to focus on. Yeah, it's great that people start. It's the completion that matters, and the focus on how do we achieve completion. And we have an incredible in the workforce system. We have an incredible story to tell about completion rates. And so I think I think we need to talk about that. The 50%, again, it's going to come down. The devil is going to be in the details of what is considered training. I know that some like career exploration. I think somebody had asked about case managers. I think there's some of that in play. Again, if you can point to direct outcomes for training and for that individual. But I think that still remains to be seen in whatever legislation might happen in the 119.
I'd say yes, completion, of course, but also, are they able to did they get employment in a livable wage? And that is where the focus is probably going to be, again, if there's focus on the middle class. And the training could be online courses, it could be a certification, it could be on the job training. I think we need to think very broadly about this issue of training. Use technology, use the private sector. It all does not have to happen in a physical place or in a traditional program. Again, we need to find these vendors that are better, faster, and cheaper, and have the flexibility to use those kinds of vendors.
Yeah,
and
if I'm not mistaken, WIOA is not an entitlement. The criteria for somebody to get into WIOA is
Oh, Ron, I think you froze on me. I think he had a really good thought there too. So, go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to make one comment while we're waiting for Ron to rejoin, hopefully complete his thought. One aspect of completion and the outcomes that we're all talking about here and have talked about is, and I know many of you are doing this, is you have to pay attention to supportive services in order for some of these participants to complete, like childcare, early learning, like housing. All these issues are inextricably tied in with helping the workforce. And so being active in those areas and being active in pursuing funding in those areas is really critical at the regional level. Ron's back, it looks like.
Yeah, sorry. Gotta love technology.
Mm-hmm.
My point was there's two criteria. First of all, somebody has to be able to benefit as a result of the services that are available in the region. And secondly, they should have the ability to complete. Those are the two criteria under WIOA. And we have a big audience, so correct me if I'm wrong. So part of this is, can somebody complete? And that's, to me, the role of Title II, the adult basic education, is to help somebody get ready. We shouldn't be necessarily dumbing down the skill development. The skill development is the skill development that it's required to perform the work. So, you got to work with Title II here to get people to the point where they can achieve the training. And I think, going back to Carol's point, I agree. I think boards should focus on that work-based learning side of how we learn to do what we do, on the job training, work experience, apprenticeship, all of those, customized skill development. I mean, all of those, I think, are good places to focus.
I agree. I mean, adults achieve and learn in context, not in theory. And we do need to make this training relevant. Relevance is really, I think, the key to success. It can't be theoretical. Do this and maybe you'll get a job. No, it's do this. This is how you do it. And this is the job you will qualify for and be eligible for. This specific job in this specific community, not maybe a job, not kinda a job, but a specific job in a specific place that pays a livable wage. And then you'll get adults' attention.
Yeah, I agree, Carol. I mean, I don't know. My math is terrible, but I got to tell you, when Penn State sends me back the analysis of my soil and tells me that if my hops are going to grow, I've got to bring my nitrogen level up, and all I have is a 40-pound bag of pulverized limestone, I have spent a lot of time on YouTube and learning my math to try and figure out, okay, so how much do I actually put on a row of hops? And I think that's that's really gets important. If my job is on the line, I'm going to learn how to do my job.
Well, and you raised a good point. When adults want to learn something, well, anybody wants to learn something these days, they go to YouTube. They don't enroll in a course or a 6-year program at the community college. They go to YouTube. And that's why I keep saying better, faster, cheaper. It's got to be relevant, and it's got to be accessible, and it can't be in theory. This is the job you will qualify for in this community if you do this, and it's not going to take you 6 years to do it.
Yeah, I think, Carol, that goes back to your point earlier about this relationship between the state and the locals, which really has to be a good, tight relationship, because what is it? Credential Engine says there's like 900,000 credentials in the U.S. You're not going to manage 900,000 from Washington, D.C., or, in my humble opinion, from Harrisburg. So if I've got a dozen critical employers in my region and they all agree that credential XYZ, they all understand what that means. They all understand that if somebody comes to their door and they have XYZ, it tells them that they have this set of competencies, then why shouldn't I be allowed to pursue who provides that training? Because I have a group of employers who understand a credential, they understand what it means. It is recognized, it's industry recognized, which should be key to the boards, the portability of that credential for the worker. And then I think they ought to be able to Carol's point, find the skill development where they find it at the quality they need.
Absolutely. So we've kind of gone through all of our formal questions. And so as we kind of look ahead, do you all have any final words of wisdom for our audience as they prepare to navigate the potential changes introduced by ASWA? And I'm going to start with Mr. Tom.
Well, I guess I would go back to somewhat what I said earlier. I mean, I think I would start now and anticipation of what you think is going to occur, because the people on this call are very savvy and knowledgeable. So I would begin now. Don't wait. And I think it's a never-ending job, but it's a critical one, and that is you have to constantly be educating and communicating about what you're doing, what you're intending to do, and what you've done, what you've accomplished in terms of results. Communication, and start innovating now.
Thank you. Carol, how about you?
Well, I think I've gotten myself in enough trouble, and I think I've said, gave some advice about it. And I echo Tom. I think to really focus on the opportunities that are real in the community, and to focus on those kinds of outcomes, because the best PR campaign is showing the outcomes, and it's about building up the middle class, creating more opportunities for more people to have livable wage. And that should be, to me, that's the focus of this administration. And that should be a topic of conversation in every community, and helping people make good decisions about the use of their time and money. And I think workforce boards have not taken advantage of the data they do have or could collect to really help people make wise decisions about what to pursue if they want to stay in their local communities. Why be shy about saying this program is not for you, not very good, actually? And maybe it's politically hard to do that because all of these vendors sit on the boards and, play golf together and have lunch together and all of that. But somebody's got to be the arbiter of quality, and help people make good consumer decisions. And I think it's a great opportunity for workforce boards. What do you think, Ron?
I would absolutely agree. First of all, with your first comment, Carol, we've probably said enough to irritate some people, but I would agree. I think, and also to put into Tom's point, there are risks. I've talked to local board directors and have talked about forecasting. I really do believe in forecasting, and people kind of, but what if we can't really see the future? What if we're wrong? Well, what if you are wrong? At least, you've gone out there and you've helped people by your thinking, you're connecting with employers. Like, okay, what works? Years ago, there was a company that made, when I was in Pittsburgh, there was a company that made a decision to stay in Pittsburgh. And we talked to them about what kind of position, what kind of skills, credentials they were going to need. And so with economic development, we looked at who was producing those credentials in Western Pennsylvania. And we looked at, well, how do they do that instruction? How do they figure out what the curriculum should be? And then we started to we also talked to the companies about, where they found workers that they thought had the credentials that they needed, and where did they get those? As a result of it, economic development folks put together a roadshow to those colleges and universities that the employers, these were very highly technical skills, that they said that's where people come from. And so they went on the road, but only to a limited number of colleges and universities to try and attract them to come to Pittsburgh. And then we would do a lot about on-the-job training when they got here around company-specific procedures. So I think those are the kind of things, to Carol's point, looking at the data and then figuring out what's our part of that, and working with the other community partners to what's our part of that. If you're in an urban setting, as I had experience with urban settings, community and faith-based organizations oftentimes have more trust with people than do more formal governmental bodies. So how closely are you working with CBOs and FBOs to see who comes in the door? Are you regularly helping them understand what kind of skills you're looking for? So as they're talking to people, they can also help guide people, at least guide them to you to say, hey, sounds like you've had some experience in some skills that we're looking for. Let me connect you to the workforce board. So I think those are the kind of things that I think boards can be doing. And also, again, coming back to, I think you got to point out the impact to state and federal legislators and also to your chief local officials. Make sure you understand or help them understand if they're investing in economic development project, how are you supporting that? Are you helping that company that they brought to the region recruit? You got to talk about what you're doing there.
Stephanie, I don't want to take your job, but somebody did ask, Carrie Manning did ask, what are the chances of reauthorization this session? So I want to hear Ron's answer to that.
Oh, well, I thought you were going to answer that first, Carol. I would certainly be, quite interested in your prognostication with regard to.
I don't know. Wahlberg is the new chairman, Congressman Wahlberg. Certainly a supporter of ASWA. Certainly a supporter of short-term Pell. If I were to guess anything, I would guess the House may make another run at it. And then when it gets over to the Senate, how big is that interest when you've got a HELP committee that's health, education, labor, and pensions? I mean, HELP has a pretty broad agenda. So I don't know. I think it's one of those things, again, that if there's any place that there's bipartisanship, it has always been around workforce development. So never say never.
I agree. I think that this new labor secretary, though, may throw a wrinkle in some things. So I would say watch the hearing, and if you can, and pay a little bit of attention to some of the signals there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much, Carol, Ron, Tom. This has been amazing conversation. And to everyone that tuned in and joined us today, we really appreciate you taking the time to kind of listen in on our conversation. The recording for this webinar will be available on our website, which is tpma-inc.com. And we look forward to continuing this conversation as things change and come forward. And want to wish you all a good rest of your Wednesday. Thank you so much.